Morning, you're listening to FloridaLA.net, and I'm Kemp Harr. This morning, my guest is Nicole Bivens Collinson, a trade law expert with Sandler, Tariffs, and Rosenberg in Washington, D.C. Nicole, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Kemp?
I'm good. I wanted to tell our listeners a little bit about how the tariffs are impacting flooring imports. I need to point out you were introduced to me by Harlan Stone with HMTX. I was asking him some questions, and he introduced us. Let's start with just giving our listener a quick background. You know, last year in the spring, President Trump announced Liberation Day. That's when he started enacting these IEEPA or emergency powers tariffs. The amount varied depending on the country, and over $100 billion worth of tariffs were collected. And then in February, the Supreme Court said that those tariffs was illegal. The funds needed to be refunded. And up to this point, $100 billion in tariffs have been refunded. So next, the president enacted Section 122 tariffs, which was a temporary tariff of 10% that had a deadline of 150 days, and that expired a few weeks ago. So now he's gotten the USTR to impose Section 301 tariffs, and for flooring, depending on the country, the amount ranges from 10 to 12.5%. Is that the way you understand it?
That's correct. So we're in a situation where right now the IEEPA tariffs are being refunded. The Section 122 tariffs are at a court challenge, and who knows what might happen. At one point, those might be refunded. And Section 301 are in effect.
And the Section 301 tariffs have been used now. He actually imposed those tariffs in his first term as president. Flooring out of China right now has a 30% tariff based on the 301 tariffs. Biden left them in place, and they've been in place now for, I think, 6 years. And they continue to hold, right?
That's correct. There were two separate investigations that were conducted under the first Trump administration, an investigation of China's policies, practices, and laws regarding the protection of intellectual property rights and trade secrets. The investigation found that they were violating trade secrets, they were violating IPR rights, and so as a result, they put tariffs on a select number of products, initially valued at $50 billion. The Chinese retaliated. The U.S. retaliated again. And we got another list. The Chinese retaliated a second time, and we retaliated on the retaliation. So we had another list. Many products from China have been subject to tariffs ranging from 7.5% to up to 100% under the Section 301 China IPR tariff. The second round of investigations using that same authority, Section 301, was on whether or not a country has a law that bans the importation of goods made with forced labor. If they have that law, do they effectively enforce it? The outcome was there really was no country that was determined to have both a law in place and to be effectively enforcing that law. So that's why we have tariffs ranging from 10% to 12.5%. Ones who are subject just to the 10%. Those countries have a law that bans the importation of goods made with forced labor, or they've signed an agreement early on with the United States under the reciprocal tariff, the IEEPA tariff. And in that agreement, they said that they would ban and effectively enforce that ban to prevent importing goods made with forced labor. For example, Trinidad and Tobago, they have a 10% tariff. And they have that because they signed an agreement with the United States early on. So that's how some countries got 10%. Any country that came to negotiate or with which the U.S. has reviewed under this agreement that did not have a law or did not have a finalized agreement, they got 12.5%. So it's not saying that a country has forced labor in that country. So it's not saying Thailand has forced labor. It's saying Thailand doesn't have a law that bans importing goods made with forced labor.
I wanted to ask the question. I think most people know this, but who pays for the tariff? The answer to that is the importer of record pays the tariff. Many people don't understand that. They think that a president puts a tariff in place punishing, say, Canada or China or whatever, but actually the tariff is being paid by the importer of record, which is usually an American company. Now, it's important to point out that while that is the case, a tariff can shift behavior. So if there are high tariffs out of one country, the importer can shift to another country, and that's really how it impacts that foreign country, right?
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, under the first Trump administration, when the tariffs were really isolated and focused on China, many companies got the signal from the administration to get out of China or source elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But then when tariffs were put on every country, suddenly that move that you may have made, as we were talking about the IEEPA tariffs, those ranged from 5% to 49%. And you may have shifted your production, let's say, to Thailand, but Thailand was facing a 29% tariff coming in now, and China was still, maybe they were at 30% all in. But that 30%, it's not enough to deter you.
So what we're saying is that these tariffs now that all countries have it, it's not going to shift behavior to have you shift from one country to another. Again, the people paying the tariff are generally the importers, which are the United States companies. And so it's another inflationary tax that makes everything more expensive, right?
Absolutely. And I think what some of your listeners may really see this in effect as we're talking about the IEEPA refunds, right? The Supreme Court ruled that those tariffs were illegal, and therefore whoever paid those tariffs should get a refund. Well, we're seeing that the companies who paid those tariffs were the U.S. companies. And now you have consumers and other groups trying to sue that U.S. company for a portion of that money back. So it's very clear that what we've seen is these tariffs are paid for by whoever's importing it. By and large, that has been U.S. companies who have eventually passed on at least a portion of those additional costs to the consumer.
One last thing before we run out of time. In 2 days, we're going to know for sure whether or not the president is going to impose a 50% tariff on Canadian goods that will affect both vinyl flooring, engineered hardwood flooring, and plywood. And what grounds is that being imposed on?
Well, I would say it's being imposed on shaky ground, but the president has said that the tariffs are being imposed because Canada is discriminating against U.S. companies vis-a-vis other companies. And the reason he's saying this is when the United States put we're pulling in another section of trade law, but when he started imposing Section 232 tariffs, which are ostensibly put in place for reasons of national security or national defense, and he put them on steel and on aluminum and on copper and on lumber and jet parts and polysilicon, and some countries retaliated, and Canada did. When they retaliated, they put tariffs on some U.S. auto products. In addition, you saw some provinces in Canada, as a form of protest, taking U.S. alcohol, particularly bourbons and whiskeys, off the shelf in their stores. And there is a dairy quota that is in place for U.S. dairy products. It's a product of the USMCA, just so you know, but this quota the United States does not feel is accurate. So they said in 3 instances, Canada is discriminating more against a U.S. company than any other country's companies, and therefore under 338, they were entitled to impose these tariffs. So they put together a list of products that would be imposed with a 50% tariff for reasons under the dairy, another one for the alcohol discrimination, and the other for the automobile discrimination. And it's quite interesting because you never know what product is going to be on there. As you said, we're looking at flooring being impacted, and the dairy list, it has a bunch of dairy products to sort of, tit for tat, but it also then has hockey sticks. So it's a mishmash of products. It represents about 5% of the trade between the United States and Canada. But for some companies, like I think your flooring people, it could represent a significant portion. And 50% is a big tariff.
All right, Nicole, I appreciate you spending time. And if other people want to know a little bit more, obviously you're an expert in this area, they can contact you. You're at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg in D.C. Again, been talking to Nicole Bivens Collinson, and you've been listening to Kemp Harr and FloorDaily.net.